Hello and welcome. Today we're going to make vegetable beef soup with the Instant Pot. This recipe is a great example of how to build flavors using the same ingredients but being cooked to different levels. So, as always, I want to thank everyone who has subscribed and has been liking and sharing the videos. And if you're not already a subscriber, subscribe to see more like this, and you may wish to hit the notification bell since YouTube is not great at telling you about new videos otherwise. For our ingredients, we'll need 2 pounds of beef. Any round or roast style cuts will work here. 1 cup beef broth. 1 tablespoon tomato paste, 2 small or 1 medium onion, 1 bell pepper, 3 to 4 carrots, 3 to 4 celery stalks, 3 to 4 garlic cloves, 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, 2 tablespoons of flour, 2 tablespoons of Worcestershire sauce, 1/4 teaspoon salt to start with, and 1/2 teaspoon of pepper to start with. We'll also need a little bit of water as well. Starting off with the beef, we will need to trim off some of the fat. Depending on how much you need to trim, you can save these and use them as a base for making things like beef gravy or to add flavor to a homemade stocks or broths. One thing we need to make sure of is to check for any tendons and silver skin. Both of these must be trimmed off for the best texture. Tendons do not have a lot of taste, and the membrane we call silver skin is hard to cut through and even harder to chew through. So you definitely want to make sure to get rid of that. Tendons will be more common in meats near where bones meet. Silver skin, on the other hand, is found anywhere you have 2 muscles right beside each other. The silver skin membrane is used to separate the muscles in the body and thus needs to be quite tough. Sometimes the silver skin is tough enough that you can slip a knife under it and make a small area where you can grab onto it, and you can pull it off slowly by working your fingers underneath to separate the muscles from it. Sadly, mine was not thick enough to be removed that easy way, and instead I need to make a series of shallow slices, somewhat like filleting them. We want to skin it off, so to speak. As you're trimming the larger pieces, you'll most likely need to trim a little bit of beef off the fat because you're almost always going to get a little bit there. All of the fat and the attached meat can be frozen, as I mentioned earlier, and added to a pan to get extra flavor for gravies, or added when making soups or stocks and broths for extra beef flavor. One of the best things you can do when making a beef gravy is to add these scraps to the pan first and just let it render out the fat. Then you take out the scraps and discard them, and this is going to give you a ton of flavor and a very nice aroma added to it. Of course, it's still gravy, so gravy doesn't really have much of an eye appeal. Skipping forward, once you've completed your trimming, it will look something like this. From there, you just want to cube your meat to about 1-inch cubes. Unfortunately, I thought I had hit the record button, but I did not. So, we have this handy chart to show you exactly what you need to do to break that down. Next up, the celery. We will just need to top and tail them. You probably don't need to cut the bottom off if you are cutting it fresh off the stalk, but if it wasn't attached to the root, you'll want to cut the bottom off. I did it on mine because it was already showing a little bit of odd coloration, so. From there, we just need to slice our pieces. I like to mostly do thin slices with a few large ones as well for added texture. Due to how fast celery cooks, they'll be melt in your mouth soft by the time your carrots are even starting to get soft. So the only real change you can make here to add a depth or texture to your soup is to make the sizes varied instead of consistent. Once we are finished with the celery, we will need to pretty much do the exact same thing when we do the carrots. Top and tail them and slice it into discs. You could also cut the carrot in half lengthwise if yours are slightly slippery or too large or round. You'll probably need to take off about 2 minutes from the final cook time if you do this, otherwise the carrots will be pretty much mushy. That would be the same, you would need to subtract those 2 minutes if you peel your carrots. I'm not going to peel them so that way they hold up a little bit longer. One thing I noticed was you definitely don't want to peel them and half them, because at that point they will attain the texture of baby food, and that's not quite what anyone's looking for. Next up, we have our bell pepper. We will begin by topping and tailing it. I'm sure you've noticed that we do that to most fruits and vegetables. This is usually because of some combination of it being bitter or too tough. From there, we just need to slice the inner white membrane that holds the seed pod into the center of the bell peppers. It's actually a bit easier to cut through the side and literally unroll the outside while you're cutting the membrane rather than try to cut it while it's still in one hoop like I'm doing here. Both methods work, it's just the unrolling is a bit safer. Once we have it unrolled and portioned out into 4 to 6 mini sheets, we want to make our pieces fairly big on this one, a bit over 1 inch in square. The reason for this is that bell peppers, as they soften, are going to shrink a little bit, and that way our end result will match the size of the beef a little better. The boss came for inspection and we have passed. Did I say approved? How about maybe approved? She's not quite sure what to make of bell peppers yet. Since this is a soup that's focused on the vegetable flavors rather than the beef, we're going to do as we did previously with our ingredients and chop them into larger pieces. We start by topping and tailing, followed by peeling the paper and the very first layer of the onion off. Once we get done with that, we just want to slice it down the middle and then slice each of those halves into 4 to 6 slices each. They are going to need to be a bit bigger because of how much faster they cook than the carrots. It also keeps our prep fairly easy and fairly quick. Since this dish has to come to pressure twice, we kind of make up for a little bit of the time that's going to take by making the prep a little bit quicker. With the carrot dictating the last cook times, there's not really a way to make these or any of the other vegetables stay firm unless we lean on that size difference. Almost done with the prep. For the garlic, we're going to need to crush the outside of the garlic under the flat of a knife and peel off the woody exterior. Once we're done, we just need to give it a quick dice. Since it's not the star of the show, we'll only be crushing it a little, followed by a fine dice. We give it the fine dice to give us the garlic taste, but in the background rather than the foreground, and the slight crushing lets us release just a bit more flavor without being overwhelming, and thus widening the flavors of the garlic that we get. Finally, we're at the last step before we begin cooking. We will be coating the outside of our beef cubes with flour. This is going to help them brown when we are at the searing part, and it's also going to act as our thickener and bring a slight nutty flavor to the party after being cooked. You just want to make sure all of the cubes are covered and that you don't miss any nooks and crannies. If one or more get too much flour on them, you can actually just tap them with your finger to knock most of the flour off that way. Also, since our broth has salt, we won't be adding any to this, which would be where you would if you were doing something like a roast or something. You might put that salt to season it in early right now, but we're not going to do that because our broth is also going to have salt, and that might end up being overly salty. And we're looking for properly salted, not Dead Sea salty. Before we start cooking, let's go over the cooking times. So we have a prep time of about 10 minutes, another 10 minutes for sauteing. Coming up to pressure is going to take between 10 and 15 minutes depending on your pressure cooker. 20 minutes to cook on high, where we will then do a manual release. We will then add our vegetables and taste to see if we need to add salt and pepper. We then need about 5 to 10 minutes to come back up to pressure, and about 5 to 8 minutes cooking time depending on how firm we want our carrots. 5 for more firm and 8 for less. Again, we follow this with either a manual release or a natural release. Due to the density of the meat, that natural release will probably take about 20 minutes. This leaves us with a cook time between an hour and just under 2 hours for the longest. You will probably most likely end up around 70 to 80 minutes. It does sound like a lot of time, but this same recipe would take us 3 to 4 hours if we were to do it on the stove or in the crock pot. Now, for the cooking, set your Instant Pot to the sauté setting and add your oil to the pot. We'll want our oil to get shimmery in appearance to know that the pot is hot enough. Once the oil does start to take on that shimmer, we want to add our beef cubes slowly to the pot, 5 to 6 at a time. Don't worry if your beef cubes don't look like mine. Mine had to sit out for a bit, and although it may no longer look like it, there still is a layer of flour there. It just loses the white coloration when the moisture from the beef hydrates some of the flour. Now, the reason we want to add the cubes very slowly is because we only want to brown most of the meat. Some I want to remain unbrowned to contrast the pieces that are browned. This will take a while of slowly adding more and more beef to the Instant Pot. The easiest way to figure out when to add just the rest of the beef is to just continue to add the beef bit by bit and brown a little bit, and then add a bit more and brown. Keep browning until the pot starts to get so crowded that you see steam coming up between the pieces. At that point, the pot's crowded and not a lot of browning can happen, so at that point you can just dump the rest of your meat in. That steaming is going to look like this, and once it reaches this stage, we can move on to the next part. Once we have finished adding all of the beef, we can then add our broth, lemon juice, Worcestershire sauce, tomato paste, and our salt and pepper. You'll need to add water to cover the beef in addition to the broth. You'll want the liquid to be about a half an inch to an inch above the beef. Once you have all of the liquid you need in it, we can just add about 25% of the vegetables to the pot. The liquid won't need to be covering them, since as they cook they're going to release a lot of moisture themselves, and the intent is for them to cook to the point that they're almost disintegrating into the soup. The rest we're going to add towards the end so we can have some control over the final firmness. The beef you see me adding here, I tried to hold some back to see if this would have a difference in texture from the stuff that just didn't get browned earlier, and it didn't, so you don't need to do that. It's just more of a complication with no real gain. This base of vegetables, though, that we're putting in now is going to make the intense flavor that we want, because this is going to disperse and, like I said, get soft enough that it almost disintegrates into everything. So our broth is going to get a little thicker from this, as well as us getting a very intense vegetable flavor from this portion that we're putting in now. And with that, we put our lid on and we want to cook, as said earlier, for 20 minutes on high pressure. And that was the sound of a manual release after our 20 minutes was up. This will probably take you a minute or two to let it come down to where you are able to remove the lid and the lock is disengaged. We have to manually release our pressure to make sure our beef doesn't overcook. We want it to have a bit of bite left to it, so essentially it falls apart in your mouth, but not before then. Do please make sure you are clear of the steam vent when you are doing this, as steam can be significantly hotter temperature than water can get to. Boiling water will generally be 212 degrees, give or take a degree or two depending on altitude, whereas steam can be 300, 400 degrees easy. There is no upper cap, so steam burns will be significantly worse than any burns coming from water. Now, as I'm sure you've already noticed above, this is also when we check for salt and pepper. I ended up adding a bit of both, about 1/4 teaspoon salt and about 1/2 teaspoon pepper, once we've finished adding all of our remaining vegetables and set our final cook time. You want to set it for either 5 minutes if you want your carrots firmer, or 8 minutes if you'd like them to be softer. 5 minutes will also leave some structure in the onions, although not a whole lot, so you might want to play around with the times to find the texture combo that you like best. This will also come back up to pressure fairly quickly since we're only adding vegetables. You may also wish to manually release the pressure if you're using the 5-minute cook time to reduce the softness even further, and at that point you'd still have some structural integrity left in both the peppers and onions. And with that, we have made a vegetable beef soup. This was made to have the beef being the back note to the amount of vegetable flavors we got, and even with only using a few vegetables, we're able to make a soup where the vegetables stand out as our prime flavor and don't get overwhelmed by the beef or anything else. This is exactly the right notes if you want a nice summer soup where the flavors are kind of like a stew, but not the heavy, dense, thick, weigh you down kind of soup. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for watching and hope you have a great day and a great meal.